Sugars ferment to acetate and butyrate. The butyrate actually feeds the rumen. Most of the 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗃𝗃, the rumen wall, it uses that butyrate as its energy source. And then, like I said, acetate and butyrate are very weak acids. Actually, acetate it's the precursor for your butterfat production. So it feeds. Mike Van Amberg had a talk a couple of years ago. He said, if you ever have a ration that's running a little kind of sluggish and it doesn't seem like it's fermenting right, throw some sugar at them, because those fiber bugs need that to kind of kickstart fermentation.
Welcome back to the Dairy Podcast Show, brought to you by 𝗦𝗽𝗃𝗃. My name is Barry Bradford from Michigan State University. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Andy Mueller to the show, who serves as the National Dairy Technical Support and Nutrition for Westway Feed Products. Andy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Barry.
So where do you live, Andy, and how much territory do you cover in your role?
So I actually live in Rochester, Minnesota, and I do national tech support for Westway. So I pretty much go wherever there's cows from coast to coast.
Cool. I bet that leads to some interesting experiences.
Yeah. I mean, for the first 15 years when I got out of grad school, I worked for a major feed company just in Minnesota. And so it's been really neat. I've been doing this job for 5 years, and there's a lot of different ways to feed cows. There's a lot of different foodstuffs out there. So quite frankly, I've been learning a lot, and that's something I enjoy doing.
Yeah.
So it keeps the days interesting, and keeps me always trying to learn new things, and gives me excuses to reach out to other university people and other resources that before, when I was in the Midwest, just didn't have time or just wasn't part of the job. So
now, did you grow up linked to the dairy industry somehow, or if not, how did you get interested?
No, I'm one of those that I always grew up out in the country, and grandparents were crop farmers, had a few beef cows in Illinois, and always spent summers with them. When I went to school, I wanted to be a veterinarian. Decided that wasn't what I wanted to do in the end, and just really kind of fell in love with nutrition and chemistry and the whole science behind it. So I went to a small school in Missouri, and then got an internship at the University of Missouri-Columbia in dairy. Spent a whole summer doing dairy research, working on their farm, and it just kind of went from there.
Beta-carotene impacts reproductive performance in cattle. Because the main sources of beta-carotene are forages, most cattle don't get enough. Victus Transition from 𝗪𝗛 contains a blend of beta-carotene and mixed tocopherols, which provide needed vitamin A and antioxidants. Victus Transition fed cattle have better fertility rates and improved colostrum quality. Make sure your cattle get the beta-carotene they need with Victus Transition. Visit dsm.com/Victus Transition.
In your current role, you're doing tech support. How do you try to stay up on sort of latest information related to your job? Are you plugged in with research? Do you have colleagues that you bounce ideas off of?
Yeah, Westway has a whole, we call it our TNT team, our technical support team. So we got a couple other dairy technical supports in Alpha, who takes care of the West, and then my counterpart, Tony Tucker, who's out in Virginia and takes care of more of the East. We always crisscross. We got a couple of beef technical support guys, but we actually then, we're owned by Eating Enough Man, which is a big trading company out of London, England. So then we have tech people and getting a lot of interesting conversations with them over in Europe. And yeah, I mean, they definitely feed cows a little different than us, and how that rumen works. So that's always interesting. But then I go to a lot of conferences. I mean, we go to most of the major dairy conferences, a member of Journal of Dairy Science. So get a lot of, keep up to date on the research. And then we're doing like I have a transition study going on right now with Dr. 𝗹𝗃𝗀𝗃 at Iowa State.
Okay.
We're looking at maybe doing a little something with 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗃𝗃 out of Michigan State. So we try to stay pretty well in the loop of what's going on, just in general around the dairy industry.
Sounds great. Sounds like a fun job. Keeps you busy, sounds like.
Yeah, there's a lot of different moving parts, and looking, and I get the daily dairy report, so I'm always trying to keep up to date on where the milk price is going. We can have a lot of nutrition advice, but I mean, when it's always a matter of where the rubber meets the road, it's got to be economically sound.
Yeah. So I'm curious to understand a little better what your day-to-day looks like. So, maybe there's a salesperson somewhere around the country that calls and says, they thought you could help with a customer. Is that kind of how it works? And then what do you do from there?
So we work a lot with nutritionists. I personally do a lot of diet evaluations, whether it's through looking at them through a ration balancing software, or I run a bunch of fermentation analysis, trying to figure out how the carbohydrates in your dairy ration are working. The whole fast pool, slow pool, how the fiber is digesting, where the starch is digesting, and looking at then, is there some tweaks we can make to the ration to increase component production or to increase feed efficiency? So yeah, I will get calls, or we'll set up an appointment to, maybe visit some nutritionists in Texas one week, go out to New York the next week, and they'll usually send me diets ahead of time. We might run one of those fermentation analysis ahead of time, and then just kind of go from there. Visit the nutritionist, visit the farm, see what's going on there. And, is there a role that sugars can play to help with the feed efficiency? We work a lot with trying to increase forage concentration in the diets. And we're a molasses and sugar company, but really everything we do is focused on rumen health. And there was a title for an article last year. I wish I could remember whose it was from, but it was Let the Rumen Do the Heavy Lifting. And that's really kind of our whole philosophy.
That's great.
So some weeks I will be on the road catching a flight somewhere. Some weeks I'll be at home doing all this kind of analysis, breaking down, trying to catch up on other research and other things going on.
Yep. I know when I had some of these conversations, 20 years ago, when sugar comes up, a lot of times people go to sort of an in vitro situation where if you dump starch and sugar in with some rumen microbes, the sugar is going to disappear faster than anything, right? Faster than starch, certainly faster than fiber. And so, right away, people tend to think about, that's likely to cause acidosis, really rapid fermentation, rapid VFA production. And yet, often when you hear people talk about sugars, they're talking about it supporting optimal fiber digestion. How does that make sense to you?
So sugars and starches feed completely different populations in the rumen. You have your amylytic bugs, which are your bugs that digest your starch. And then you have your fibrolytic bugs, which digest fiber. So the bugs that use sugars are the ones that digest your fiber. And when sugars ferment, because those fibrolytic bugs are fermenting them, it goes to make acetate and butyrate. It can make some propionate, but that's usually a very small population amount of VFAs. So your acetate and your butyrate they're very weak acids, and there's no pathway for them to go to lactic acid, because when you dump in, say, a bunch of really fine ground starch, and it ferments really fast, you make propionate, but there's a pathway when that builds up to go over to lactic acid and make acidosis. Sugars ferment to acetate and butyrate. The butyrate actually feeds the rumen. Most of the rumen papilli, the rumen wall, it uses that butyrate as its energy source. And then, like I said, acetate and butyrate are very weak acids. Actually, acetate it's the precursor for your butterfat production. So it feeds. Mike Van Amberg had a talk a couple of years ago. He said, if you ever have a ration that's running a little kind of sluggish and it doesn't seem like it's fermenting right, throw some sugar at them, because those fiber bugs need that to kind of kickstart fermentation. So the protozoa and fungi are also really important in the rumen, and they use a lot of sugars. And those fungi are the ones that they get in on that piece of fiber. And as they're using the sugar, they're growing and they're cracking open that cuticle, that outer waxy layer, and allowing the other bacteria to get in there and break it down. So sugars they ferment quickly and they're gone quickly, but the way they ferment, they don't reduce rumen pH. They don't have a risk of going to acidosis. They actually help your fiber degraders and help increase your butterfat production. And so through increasing fiber digestion, we also look at having positives on dry matter intake and just overall rumen health when you have a better rumen pH.
So when you're assessing a diet, are there particular hallmarks that you're looking for to drive you to say, this is a diet that could really benefit from some additional sugar?
Yeah, if we're looking at, when I'm doing a fermentation analysis, if there's ways to measure efficiency and if it seems like we're not maximizing the rumen, if it's a really high starch ration, sometimes we see those for different reasons. The way it's fermented, you'll get 32% starch rations. A lot of times because that's not breaking down well. Well, sugars, if you back that back down and add sugars, you'll keep the NFC level the same in the ration, but you'll find because we're getting more fermentation that's going to help it get out quite a bit. If you have a ration where you're struggling with butterfat, have some maybe diet-induced milk fat depression, sugars can a lot of times help that by rearranging kind of, are we low on fiber because the fiber pool is not feeding well? Adding some sugar will really help that fiber kind of break down and maybe relieve some of the necessity for a high starch diet. If I see a ration where it's really low in rumen degradable protein, that's kind of number one thing when I'm assessing a ration on if we need sugars in it, is we also want to look at that protein, because the fiber bugs, the bugs that use sugar, are also those bugs that just have a basic requirement for raw nitrogen. They don't really need complex amino acids. So we want to make sure we have enough rumen degradable protein in that ration. And there's been more research out that, if we don't have enough rumen degradable protein, we're definitely not running the rumen efficiently. And we're probably giving up some amino acids in some production. So kind of looking at the fiber level, looking at overall starch levels, because if we can get maximizing that rumen efficiency, that means we have less dependence on, say, some more expensive ingredients like bypass protein, blood meals, and those type of things. So, and I've noticed when I've tracked some farms, when we've been adding sugars, we can increase a little bit of forage concentration in the diets. I've noticed both some nice butterfats and some nice milk protein responses lately. So looking at that one, I have to think that we must be increasing, we have to be increasing our carb efficiency and making more amino acids if we're seeing a nice milk protein response. It's not a given, but there are definitely situations where we see a milk protein response to go along with butterfat and components, overall production.
Yep.
What we learned about back in basic nutrition.
Sounds good. Well, if you're listening and this is triggering some questions, take a moment and drop some comments in whatever interface you're using. Get some discussion going here, because I think there's a lot of interesting pieces to follow up on here. So I guess the next question in my mind, Andy, is what's an appropriate sugar concentration? And if that depends on the rest of the diet, what do you look at to decide what the target is?
So most rations, unless you're, say, on the West Coast feeding a lot of byproducts, most rations in the Midwest, Northeast, they're only going to be about 1 to 3% sugar in the ration. And most of that's going to come from forages. And the forages, especially for the fermented forages, your corn silage, your alfalfa haylage, those type, you get your analysis back and it's going to have 2 or 3% sugar. Well, those are all 5-carbon sugars, which are actually very slow to degrade in the rumen, if at all. If we're talking digestion rates, it's maybe 10% per hour. And just as an example, molasses is about 60% per hour. So typically, most rations don't really have much sugar in them to start with. Optimizing for fiber. So you can either talk about total sugar or added sugar. It's probably easier for us to talk about added sugar in the ration.
Okay.
So we're usually talking about 5 to 7% added sugar is optimal for fiber digestion. And that's going to probably equivalent to about 7 to 9% if you include the sugars that are coming from some other forages.
And then, of course, that wraps into it sources of sugar. You mentioned some byproducts, like citrus pulp is a good example. Will bring quite a bit of sugar with. But even if you're adding sugar directly, it can come from like whey, right, versus molasses. Are there differences in how those different sugar sources feed?
Yeah, I mean, your most common ones are molasses, which is purely sucrose, glucose and fructose. It ferments fast. 60% per hour is what the fermentation rate is. Whey is another popular sugar source. Whey, if you remember, that is lactose. So that is a glucose and a galactose put together. It ferments a little slower. Reason being is it's a little harder for those. Anytime you're talking fermentation, you're talking the bacteria have to have an enzyme to split that. So they have to split the glucose and galactose to make it available for them to ferment. And that's just a little harder bond to break. And if you think about it, over time, when would an adult ruminant out on the open prairie ever seen lactose? they wouldn't. So there's not a whole lot of there. They ferment that glucose quite readily. The galactose is a lot harder. Maybe 20% of it gets fermented. So it's got a slower digestion rate, about 30%. We say whey is a great energy source. It's a great corn replacer. Corn has a similar digestion rate of anywhere from 15 to 30%, depending on, the grind and the moisture content. So when you're talking about just as a raw energy source, the sugar from lactose really kind of pairs up as far as a corn replacer. Molasses is that readily available sugar source that those fiber bugs can actually use and ferment. There are some byproducts, like you said, beet pulp. The real sugar content of beet pulp is only about 2%. That's their job, is to harvest all of it. The other 8 to 10% that's in beet pulp is a lot of digestible fructans and other carbohydrates. Good energy source, works a little differently in the rumen. And then, like you mentioned, citrus pulp, that's actually pretty high in glucose too. And those are our main ones. There's some other byproducts around that can have some sugar sources, but the digestion rates can vary. And that's really the important part, because sugars really kind of kickstart that fermentation and help those fiber bugs out. So if you're trying to maximize the rumen and really get that forage fermentation off and running, that's where the molasses helps. The other kind of 5-carbon sugar sources, your lactose, some of your other ones that are a little slower degrading, are great energy sources for the rumen. And again, they're not going to have that negative on rumen pH like an overabundance of starch will, but they just work a little differently on those fiber bugs.
How do you think about targeting sugar sources to different stages of lactation? Do you pretty much use it across the board from fresh to late lactation cows, or is it different strategies?
We use it across the board. It's like any feed stuff. Who's going to respond the most? It's your fresh cows and your high cows. Anytime you're tweaking a ration. It's really good for fresh cows because whenever we add molasses, we see an increase in dry matter intake. So for pre-fresh cows, that's great. In fact, we even feed it we feed molasses in pre-fresh. Yes, it has some potassium, but the benefits we see on the dry matter intake of 2 to 4 pounds really helps out that pre-fresh cow. And we can put anionic salts in molasses product to make it balance and work for a 𝗍𝗽𝗃 ration. Fresh cows, again, that molasses helps with that dry matter intake. It helps with fiber digestion. We're always worried about intakes, acidosis, and any other health issues with fresh cows. So, hey, got molasses on that fresh cow ration. We know we're going to pick up a little bit of intake. We know when it ferments, it's less likely to cause acidosis. So those are all benefits. And then high cows. We're always trying to maximize intake to maximize production. So if we can increase fiber digestion, increase feed efficiency, that's just a win-win for high production cows. Late lactation cows, we're always going to see, because of the way it ferments, we will see a response on components. But you got girls that are 250 days in milk. It's really hard to pull anything else out of them. But most of the time, and what we recommend is have a base sugar level across the diet, because that's just going to help overall intake and components.
Yep.
It's really for all stages, but man, those pre-fresh, fresh and high cows are the ones that really blossom when you get a little bit of intake from having that sugar source in there.
Maximize profitability and herd health with early detection in animal health, reproduction, and feeding. The most advanced bolus technology and professional support from agricultural experts make this possible with SmaxTech, the health management system that future-proofs your dairy operation.
I can imagine there'd be at least some nutritionists that would play with trying to price sugar in a least cost formulation strategy. And I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect it would be rare where it would bump corn out right on a dollars per calorie type of basis. How do you talk people through why you think it still makes sense to add the sugar to the diet, even if the least cost optimizer doesn't pull it in?
Actually, it depends on what area of the country you're in and if you're shipping corn. So they're on down in the southwest, southeast, out in California. A lot of times because of the cost of shipping corn, it can just price in above in general. I'm in the Midwest. You're in Michigan. We're in corn country. I don't know in my 20 years if I've ever seen where price of molasses has been cheaper than price of corn.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do is we're looking at, it's like any other feed stuff. You're always comparing. If you want to compare corn to molasses, like I said, you're feeding the amylytic bugs, you're feeding the cellulitic fiber bugs. So they feed different populations. You're trying to make propionate for milk production with starch. You're trying to make acetate and butyrate for butterfat, primarily for with the sugars. And then the other part of it is what kind of response are we going to be getting with it? So if we can get that dry matter intake response, get a milk production response, then the sugars will more than pay for themselves on that side. So it comes down to just doing a proper evaluation. I kind of compare it to, well, if you're going to say all carbohydrate sources are the same in the rumen, it's the same as saying all protein sources are the same, right?
Yep.
The individual sugars ferment differently. We know different amino acids work differently. So why don't we just all feed distillers? Because it's the cheapest protein source a lot of places, as opposed to we feed bypass soybean meal, canola, blood meal. It's for the different amino acids that have a different effect on production. It's the same way with starch versus sugars. If you're feeding the right population of the bugs, we'll see that production response, we'll see a feed efficiency response, and it more than pays for itself. Just like that's why we spend a little extra on the blood meal, and we just don't feed all distillers. Same thing. Got to feed the rumen properly. It's got a bunch of different bacteria and protozoa in there, and we're trying to just make it as efficient as possible.
How much is Westway getting involved in delivering molasses supplements in robotic milking systems?
So we do see it getting used in robotics. We tend to use it a lot in the PMR. That's the partial mixed ration at the feed bunk. We do have some farms that add it as part of the reward feed. I see a couple. There's definitely positives in it. A couple of there can be some natural issues though. Molasses is sticky, so adding it to the reward feed, you could end up making a mess at your reward feeder. And the other thing is really when we're talking about getting that sugar response. So I tell everybody that there's 3 ways I can guarantee you sugars will fail. One is not feed enough. If you just don't, I relate it back to when we started doing amino acid balancing 25 years ago. It was going to cost 25 cents to add that 11 grams of methionine. So what did we all do? We added 3 or 4 grams because, hey, I could afford 10 cents. We prayed we got a response, but it's almost impossible to tell. Same way with sugars. It's great if you want to feed, 3/4 of a pound or half a pound or even just a straight pound of molasses, but it's not enough to move the needle. Number 2 is what I already talked about. The protein side, if you don't have enough rumen degradable protein, you won't see a response because the fiber bugs need that rumen degradable protein. The bugs will always burn that carbohydrate and they'll always make VFAs. But if they don't have the protein, they're not going to grow. They're not going to reproduce. You're not making more microbial protein, which is the driver of milk production. And the third way is, in order to have proper fiber fermentation, you have to have a good rumen pH. So if it's one of those low fiber, high starch rations that we probably shouldn't be feeding, you can add all the sugar you want, but if there's not a fiber population to stimulate because of where rumen pH is, we're just not going to see an effect. So that takes me back to the robot side. Most of the time we're trying to get 10 pounds total of robot feed. And, so you're dividing that up amongst 3 visits, 3 pounds total. You're going to maybe get, if you're going to make some molasses, 1/2 pound to 1.5 pounds of total molasses will work in that robot feed. And it will help them eat. They love the taste of molasses, but that's not going to supply enough sugars to give you a big response without still having some in the PMR.
Okay.
It can drive them because we want them to go to that robot feed, but it comes down to we need to feed enough to stimulate those fiber degraders. So if we can't get enough in there, and the other thing is, molasses is quite sticky. We all know that. So you kind of have to thin it out to get it to go through some of the tubings for that. So that's going to you're going to have to dilute it down. That might lower the sugar content. I'd rather see it be put in the PMR. You'll see that intake response there, especially in the summertime to help reduce sorting. It kind of holds it all together. So it's still a better product probably for I think in the PMR, just how it works overall in the rumen and some of the other effects we see.
One last question on that. So we've seen a lot of interest in analyzing milk fatty acid profile in the last few years because it's become cheaper to do at least an approximation. Do you see people looking at de novo fatty acid yield as one way to assess response to adding some sugar?
I'm a big supporter of that. If we can get that either by some creameries do it, if we can track that, or if we can pull milk samples ahead of changing up the ration with molasses, we'll monitor the de novos because the sugars are feeding those fiber bugs. Like I said, the fiber bugs are the ones that do all the biohydrogenation. So they take that unsaturated fat, whether it's from distillers. I mean, we kind of forget that the number one source of fat in our rations just are corn products. Just corn alone, corn silage adds the vast majority of fat into a lot of rations. And that's all unsaturated fat. So it's your fiber degraders that do that biohydrogenation, take that unsaturated fat, make it saturated so we don't get any of those negative effects downstream at the mammary gland. So when we add sugars, if we're able to manipulate the starch level, help increase rumen pH, which we see, we should help improve that biohydrogenation. And then I see, when we're able to track it, a bigger de novo. So I do a lot of tracking with that because we typically see when we're seeing a butterfat response, if we can go back and track it, it's always because we're increasing the de novos, which I also look at as, hey, we're making the rumen do that heavy lifting. We're making it efficient. We're making it healthy. Happy rumen is a happy cow.
It's time for our famous three. Introducing 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗃 𝗚3.0, Volac's comprehensive and complete solution to reduce the negative impact of naturally occurring toxins on ruminants. 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗃 𝗚3.0 is a species-specific product designed to mitigate the effects of specific mycotoxins in the gastrointestinal tract of ruminants. 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗃 𝗚3.0 also offers lipopolysaccharides binding capabilities. Endotoxins such as LPS can contribute to inflammation in ruminants, with energy partitioned to mount an immune response instead of production. Learn more about 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗃 𝗚3.0 at volac.com.
All right, that's a good catchphrase to end on. We got three last questions, though, that we have to bounce off you. We can't let you out of these. So your first question, what's your favorite dairy-related book or resource?
If you can't tell, I'm kind of a rumen guy and do a lot with rumen dynamics and VFA production and how that all functions. So, I mean, I still go back to the NRC and just how the rumen works in general. There's been a couple of good write-ups lately. Mary Beth Hall had a tri-state conference write-up. I think it was 2017, and so did Jeff Firkins on just general carbohydrate fermentation. It did touch quite a bit on sugars, and I've referenced those quite a bit on where we're getting our VFAs from, how it affects the rumen, how we're affecting fiber digestion. So for me, those are just some good write-ups, and I just go back to, I think when I was doing dairy rations, you get busy taking samples, looking at your computer, balancing everything, and you don't always have time to kind of stop and think, okay, what is this actually doing in the rumen? How am I influencing fiber digestion? Did I move VFA production?
Yep.
Did I affect it? Some of those little things that I didn't always have time. So it's just kind of good to always go back and just review that general rumen fermentation and yields that we get from carbohydrates.
Okay, a little broader vantage point. What's your favorite book or resource outside of agriculture?
So in my previous job, I did a lot of car travel. Now I do a lot more flight travel. So I kind of got into books on tape, and I don't really have time to do a lot of other reading. And I kind of stumbled across, I probably have to admit, my favorite writer, Stephen King. He's got a lot of interesting books out there. So he's got a lot of them. A lot of them have been turned into movies, and they do not do a very good job in taking them from books to movies. But no, I enjoy probably some of those type of Stephen King novels or books. They tend to keep me interested on some long trips.
Better than falling asleep.
And you eventually you can only listen to so many sports games and so many other podcasts where it's kind of a nice change of pace.
All right. Lastly, in your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those who are less successful?
I think attention to detail. There's a lot that goes on farms. If you're a nutritionist, there's a lot that goes on if you're a researcher. So it's easy to get lost in the woods. It's easy to get sidetracked. So attention to detail, having a plan when you're looking at a ration, what are the goals of the farm? What's the goals of the ration? What do I have for feedstuffs? What can go on? How can I manipulate them through the ration to make them better? I always tell people, we get good forages and we get bad forages. And if it's a good forage, we just want to feed the snot out of it and make as much milk. But we don't always get that. And then we got to look at, can we substitute or are we going to supplement to make it better? And then how does that all price in? So there's a lot of things we can do. We get pulled in a lot of directions. So just starting out with some attention to details and kind of having like a better word, a plan. I always go back to the quote, I think it was Mike Tyson, that said, everybody's always got a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And that's really true. But, if you kind of start your day out with, okay, these are the 4 or 5 tasks that need to get done, whether it's in the office or, hey, these are the 2 or 3 objectives I need to talk to the dairy producer about, I need to observe on the farm, you'll move the needle forward and, you'll just get a lot more accomplished and be more successful.
Well, Dr. Andy Mueller, thank you for joining us on the Dairy Podcast Show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So again, this has been another episode of the Dairy Podcast Show, brought to you by 𝗺𝗽𝐺𝑒netics. If you haven't taken a chance yet, go ahead and click that subscribe button or like button so that you don't miss the next episode. And we will look forward to seeing you next time.